Welcome to the Arms Control Primer, a podcast by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I'm your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control based in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments on the most critical issues. Whether you are new to the topic or need a refresher, please join us in our exploration of the nuclear past, present, and future. In this season, we examine the histories and policies of countries that may have had nuclear weapons ambitions or even nuclear arsenals and gave them up. We search for lessons for non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. I hope it helps you better know a non-nuke.
West Germany's accession to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty played an important role to strengthen the emerging regime of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and to strengthen global normative considerations against the spread of nuclear weapons.
There are about 10 tactical nuclear weapons in an airbase in Germany. And throughout the last 30 years, they have remained there. And now, of course, ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the necessity and utility of these weapons has gained much more importance. And all these questions of extended deterrence, what's Germany's role in all of this, is very much alive.
Despite never building nuclear weapons, few countries have influenced nuclear history and global policies more than Germany. The worry that Germany would build nuclear weapons during the Second World War prompted the United States to launch the Manhattan Project. Concerns about German nuclear intentions were major drivers of the creation of the NATO Nuclear Planning Group and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. German insecurity led to the NATO double-track decision in the late 1970s, paving the way to the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And while no country has promised not to build nuclear weapons more than Germany, today it is leading the charge for closer European nuclear cooperation. Our guides through Germany's role in shaping the nuclear age are Professor Marina Henke and Professor Andreas Lutsch. While East Germany has its own fascinating history as a host of Soviet nuclear weapons, today's conversation traces the historical continuity of West Germany to today's unified federal republic.
My name is Marina Henke. I'm a professor of international relations at the Hertie School in Berlin, and I'm also the director of the Center for International Security in Berlin. My research is on strategic topics, so grand strategy, but also nuclear security and European security and defense policy. The first West German chancellor, Adenauer, he gets elected in 1949, but at the time, Germany was still not a fully sovereign state. So all questions related to Germany's security and foreign policy were still in the hands of this Allied High Commission. It was a structure created by the Allied powers. And Germany only becomes fully sovereign in 1955 and then immediately becomes a member of NATO. In this process of rebuilding the Bundeswehr, Germany also signs an agreement with the United States, which was called the Mutual Defense Assistance Clause. In this agreement, Adenauer officially renounces that Germany would ever develop its own nuclear program. But what's really interesting about this, Adenauer later on, even in his biography, interpreted this agreement under the international legal condition of rebus sic stantibus. This is a Latin phrase for saying, for as long as things remain the same, meaning yes, Germany renounces to ever possess nuclear weapons, but only for as long as the United States was protected. Because the main objective of this agreement was that the United States would send massive military aid to Germany. Ever since, under Adenauer, but then also under his successors, Chancellor Erhard and Kiesinger, Germany played and used in bargaining settings this possibility of actually acquiring nuclear weapons or having nuclear latency. And sometimes it was quite powerful in doing that, and other times it quite failed. Germany thought about nuclear weapons very strategically in the early days of its existence, West Germany. It's quite interesting to understand why Germany was so focused on nuclear weapons. And I think there were two main reasons. The first reason was that, of course, Germany was in a dire security situation. This was after the Korean War, but NATO expected that the Soviets might launch an attack on Western Europe. That was an absolute possibility. And the Soviet Union was assumed as having more conventional capabilities had more troops and also just in general, more military capabilities on the conventional level. They were, of course, also a nuclear power since 1949. But in the big picture, the deterrence strategy, but also the strategy that NATO wanted to implement in case of a Soviet attack, involved nuclear weapons from the get-go. West Germany played a very interesting role, especially in the plans of how to defeat a Soviet attack, because Germany was a frontline state, and it fell on Germany to hold off the Soviets until the reinforcements from the United States, and to a certain degree also from Britain, would arrive. The expectation was that West Germany would be obliterated because this was the first line of attack. And the defense would actually only arrive once the Soviets were expected already to hit the Rhine. This is almost on the other side of West Germany. For the German military, including the buildup of the Bundeswehr, nuclear weapons became absolutely critical because they wanted that they would be used very early on. And of course, the key purpose here was deterrence. It was a message to send to the Soviet Union: if you cross that inner German border, you will launch a nuclear war immediately. It will not be a conventional war. It will be a nuclear war. And so Germans, by the way, throughout the Cold War, were advocating for this very early nuclear use. But in all of this, of course, there was uncertainty. There was uncertainty whether the United States would actually first allow that early nuclear use and extend the deterrence and the involvement of the United States. And all of this was always insecure, and still till today. So these discussions, they ebbed, but now they're back. When we think about the pursuit of nuclear weapons, we always look at different drivers. Very often it is security related, but sometimes it's also related for other reasons. And France always stands out. One can make a case that France pursued nuclear weapons because of prestige and status concerns. And after the Second World War, it was no longer perceived as a great power. And via nuclear weapons, it would regain the status of great power. And we also see in remarks and all sorts of other archival evidence that we have from Adenauer and his cabinet, and to a certain degree also the German Bundeswehr, that Germany also suffered under these status concerns and was very much worried about not being taken seriously.
My name is Andreas Lutsch. I'm a professor of intelligence analysis in the Federal University of Applied Administrative Sciences in Berlin. As a historian, I did research on Germany's, and to be more precise, West Germany's position in the international nuclear order, with a focus especially on the Cold War, but also the years after the Cold War. That's about reunified Germany. West German government intentions concerning nuclear deterrence were an important element in how West Germany positioned itself in a world where nuclear weapons and nuclear threats existed. An analytic focus on intentions was at the time highly relevant, and it also remains highly relevant in hindsight. Intentions with respect to nuclear deterrence and even the question of a potential pursuit of a national nuclear force. At the same time, it is questionable to speak of nuclear ambitions in the case of West Germany. The term nuclear ambitions is quite suggestive. It tends to convey the impression that there was, or that at least there might have been, a hidden agenda, so to say, or even a conspiracy to seek and at some point acquire nuclear weapons. When it comes to the high-level timeline of West German nuclear intentions, a crucial period stretched over 20 years from the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s. To be more precise, this is the period from the Paris Accords of 1954 and 1955 to West Germany's accession to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. West Germany signed the NPT in 1969 and completed the ratification process in 1975. In this period, West Germany's approach to nuclear weapons policy, and hence also its approach to nuclear deterrence, crystallized. And this emerging approach continued to shape Germany's nuclear security policies also after the Cold War and indeed to this day. There are three core elements of this emerging approach. Number one, nuclear security policy in the case of West Germany was a means to strengthen the country's Western alignment and hence its alliance with Western European and North American states in the Euro-Atlantic Security Order. A second key element of West Germany's emerging approach to nuclear weapons policy was this. Nuclear deterrence in NATO was deemed necessary for survival, whereas the national control of nuclear weapons was not. In parallel and gradually, Germany's status as a non-nuclear weapons state was stabilized and legally codified step by step in the Paris Accords of 1955, then when West Germany acceded to the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1964, and finally also the accession to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, again in the time frame 1969 to 1975, and last and certainly not least, an important threshold in the process of the reinforcement of Germany's status as a non-nuclear weapon state, that was the 2+4 Treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany, an important treaty in the context of Germany's reunification in 1990. The third element of the emerging approach of West Germany with respect to nuclear weapons policy was that the United States remained vulnerable to Soviet nuclear forces, and indeed the Soviet nuclear threat increased over time. So these two powers were locked in a strategic situation called mutual nuclear vulnerability. And in this context, it was thought also in Bonn, West Germany's capital at the time, that U.S. extended nuclear deterrence required selective nuclear escalation options backed by robust U.S. strategic nuclear forces to potentially limit damage to the United States and American allies in Europe. If we consider the first key threshold here in this entire period, so the Paris Accords, it is important to note that West Germany became member of NATO and the Western European Union, and the WEU itself grew out of the Brussels Treaty of 1948. The Paris Accords also ended the occupation regime in West Germany that was in place since 1945. And in turn, West Germany's allies pledged to support the goal of trying to achieve a reunified Germany in the future. And importantly, West Germany declared not to produce atomic, biological, and chemical weapons in its territory. Then in the years that immediately followed, so the late 1950s and then early 1960s, there was a lot of dynamic change and there were many uncertainties, especially the Second Berlin Crisis. Another important element of change, which had wide-ranging effects, was that NATO member states established what is nowadays still called nuclear sharing in NATO, based on a decision made at the NATO summit in late 1957. And so West Germany participated in NATO nuclear sharing. In the Cold War, Germany's Air Force and also the Army procured and operated major weapons systems which were capable of delivering nuclear weapons. For example, the German Air Force initially procured US-produced F-104 Starfighter aircraft and later on also Pershing ground-launched ballistic missiles. Again, systems which were capable of delivering nuclear weapons. And these nuclear weapons remained under U.S. custody and control. That is very important to understand in this context. We are talking about a U.S.-controlled and safeguarded nuclear weapons potential in Europe, including in West Germany. And so allies like Germany procured and held ready major weapon systems capable of delivering those nuclear weapons. German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, in particular, was active on the highest political level to seek to create conditions for a potential political agreement with the key Western allies. But in any case, he sought to create political conditions for being potentially able to turn West Germany into a nuclear armed state, if ever deemed necessary. And this in itself was highly important at the time and carried tremendous political and strategic weight within alliance and NATO discussions.
In the mid-1950s, there was civilian research in nuclear technology, and the Germans were allowed to do it. And it wasn't hard because actually they still had some nuclear scientists. The technology to split an atom was present in West Germany. But in this critical period of the late 1950s, early 1960s, when the second Berlin crisis happened, they were not very advanced. They could actually not break out. They were so far away from actually developing a nuclear weapon. By the late 1960s, they had moved much closer. And so German latency had become a reality. And truth to be told, that is a reality even today. So ever since, Germany could probably produce, if it really wanted, a nuclear weapon. And we're not talking about a massive arsenal. We're talking about maybe 5, 6, 7, 10 nuclear warheads. But the capability of enriching uranium to such high levels, and also the facility, of course, to putting it on a rocket or some missile, Germany possesses both of these technical capabilities. And so latency was a reality. Of course, Germany then renounced. It had to get dragged to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, but it did sign it. But even after the NPT, one can make an argument that Germany tried to hedge. And here, I know historians are working right now in a variety of archives, but there's certain evidence that Germany provided a lot of financing to Israel for them to build up their nuclear capabilities. And they also finance and provide technical assistance to Brazil during the Brazilian dictatorship. And I don't want to make a statement that both of these initiatives was based that Germany, in case of need, could access highly enriched uranium. But of course, politically, one could make an argument the goodwill built up in both of these instances, whether this is Israel or Brazil, could have potentially led to the possibility of West Germany accessing highly enriched uranium in both instances. It's quite interesting to dig deeper and ask, were both of these cooperation programs, whether just being driven by commercial interests, so Germany making money, or was there really also a strategic dimension to it in case of US abandonment that Germany could potentially break out and develop its own nuclear weapon?
Marina Henke explains how West German insecurity in the 1960s led to the creation of the NATO Nuclear Planning Group to give it a bigger voice in decision-making.
Eisenhower was quite forward-leaning and said it's a good idea for the Europeans to have these nuclear weapons still owned by the United States, but give the Europeans some kind of flexibility and certainly have them on the ground in Europe. The Soviets were furious about it. They absolutely hated it. They interpreted the Potsdam Agreement of 1945 as saying that West Germany had to stay a neutral state. And they perceived it as a buffer zone, and they would not tolerate West Germany having nuclear weapons. And I think now in hindsight, we know that the second Berlin crisis around the 60s had two drivers. One was certainly the massive exodus of people from the Soviet sphere of influence, East Germany and Warsaw Pact states. But the second driver was also Khrushchev could not tolerate that West Germany was maybe slowly walking closer to having nuclear weapons, having more of a say in NATO nuclear policy. And so he escalated this crisis. And this is when Kennedy changed his mind because he got scared of a nuclear escalation. Of course, Cuba came right after, and he de facto sided with the Soviet Union and said West Germany should not get nuclear weapons. And all these legal agreements and that flexibility and frankly, quite a loose handling of US-owned nuclear weapons in Western Europe needed to stop. And West Germany was not happy about it. They tried to negotiate and push and pull and bargain. But in the big picture of things, the regime became much more structured. And the position that Kennedy then took, that West Germany should not have access to nuclear weapons in an easy way there until the end of the war. So there was, under Kennedy, this discussion of having a NATO multilateral force. This was a type of agreement where you would have mixed units on nuclear submarines, not just by Americans or British, but also potentially by Germans and Dutch and Italians. And they could then decide, always with American agreement, a mixture of the use of nuclear weapons, but it actually went nowhere. It got stopped by President Johnson in the United States because it was very divisive. Brits were actually not really in favor. The French were totally against it. This was, of course, also under Charles de Gaulle. They had their own force de frappe. But still, this MLF force then turned into the NATO Nuclear Planning Group, which was thought of as a replacement where Germans would have the possibility of discuss these nuclear issues in a NATO framework.
Joining the Non-Proliferation Treaty was complicated for West Germany. Andreas Lutsch explains why.
The Non-Proliferation Treaty and West Germany's accession to the Non-Proliferation Treaty had no practical effect on the whole issue of whether West Germany might, under certain circumstances, seek a national nuclear force. Certainly, the NPT reinforced Germany's status as a non-nuclear weapon state, and indeed, it established this status in a formal sense, given that the NPT explicitly introduced the terminology of non-nuclear weapons states. West Germany's accession to the Non-Proliferation Treaty did not mean that the country reversed a course of action or that it reversed even the direction of its national security and nuclear policy. After years of domestic political controversy, intense governmental consideration of the great variety of issues related to the NPT and NPT provisions, and also after many thorough rounds of consultations with major allies like the United States, West Germany's accession to the Non-Proliferation Treaty played an important role to strengthen the emerging NPT regime. When it comes to West German government's perceptions of NPT negotiations at the time, it is very important to understand that the threshold of autumn 1966 was deemed much more important than the signing of the NPT in 1968, because in the autumn of 1966, the United States and the Soviet Union achieved agreement on the Articles 1 and 2 of the later NPT, and these two articles were seen, at least in Bonn at the time, as the core of the emerging Non-Proliferation Treaty. And in late 1966, there was also a widely shared estimate that it was highly likely that a non-proliferation treaty would come into existence, actually sooner rather than later. The threshold of autumn 1966 was tremendously important in the situation at the time, and also in hindsight, Western governments assessed this crossing of this Rubicon, so to say, to be more important actually than the signing of the NPT later, because the signing itself was deemed as something that would be highly likely to follow, given the basic consensus among the two superpowers about the core of the NPT. And so this diplomatic breakthrough in US-Soviet relations caused a shock moment in West Germany at the time. It was initially unclear what indirect control of nuclear weapons was supposed to mean. In parallel, West Germany also insisted on receiving an explicit assurance from the Soviet Union that the Soviet Union would refrain from using force and from threatening the use of force, especially if countries like West Germany or other NATO allies signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Even in the final decade of the Cold War, West German nuclear anxieties were central to developments between the United States and the Soviet Union, from initiating the 1979 double-track decision in NATO to the negotiation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty.
This was the time when Reagan was president, and he very much believed in this concept of peace through strength. And he massively increased American defense spending after Jimmy Carter had decreased it. And he was playing around with all sorts of projects, the famous Star Wars project, which promised missile defense shield around the United States. But all of a sudden, the notion that there could be actually World War III became technically real. And it was also, from a US perspective, it was intentional, because they wanted to signal to the Soviet Union, you cannot win this war. We are so beyond when it comes to technology that you're toast. And so you have to give up. And now, credit where credit is due, one can say that this was one of the elements why the Soviet Union agreed to negotiate the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement that is no longer in existence. And I don't know if it will ever come back. I think there are all sorts of interests right now, also in the Asia Pacific for the United States, that say this agreement should not come back. So the INF agreement, huge success, by the way. One can also say that it led to all sorts of other nuclear agreements that followed, eliminated this entire class of intermediate nuclear forces, and what led then also to the fall of the Iron Curtain. So there was an assessment with Gorbachev, Woodrow, that they indeed could no longer keep up, and they had to get out of this arms race because the money was not there. They were already spending about 18% of their GDP on defense, and they could no longer sustain that. But from a West German perspective, it was going back. The idea was World War III would happen on German soil. So the Americans would be protected. There was an ocean between Western Europe and the United States. But these nuclear exchanges and these battles, they would happen on West German soil. And so it had to be prevented. And so I think this is where two different strategic objectives, the one strategic objective by the Reagan administration of deterring the Soviet Union, proclaiming we can defeat you, clashed with the German conception of you are heightening the possibility of an actual escalation, and this escalation would actually happen on our soil and not yours.
Nuclear weapons were never far from the discussion about Germany, even during reunification. Marina Henke shares what she has read in the archives.
What's really fascinating when I looked at the historical records is that even Jim Baker, Secretary of State of the Bush administration, who negotiated German reunification or the 2+4 treaty, he told his Soviet counterparts, you need to allow East Germany to become a member of NATO. Why? Because otherwise Germany might actually be inclined to develop nuclear weapons. So we need to have them in a secure place under American supervision so that Germany wouldn't break out. It's very fascinating because most people would say in 1990, your last idea that the Germans had was developing nuclear weapons. But the United States in this case used actually the latency question in their negotiations with the Soviets. In the big picture of things, the newly reunified Germany, of course, focused on other issues, and it massively slashed defense spending. Germany was not interested in nuclear weapons, and to the contrary, spent a lot of money on funding arms control agreements and even disarmament. And it was very much one of the advocates of working towards a nuclear-free world. At least from the Foreign Office, it was one of the priorities. Certainly, the German population was asking what's actually the utility of nuclear weapons, and they were very much anti-nuclear. And it's quite interesting because they played such a crucial role through the Cold War. So when I have students in my class asking what's the utility of nuclear weapons, then I would only point them to bits and pieces of German history where clearly they played a very important role. But what then happened also is that, especially based on Green Party ideas, Germany also abolished its civilian nuclear program. Now, I think this is partially criticized, but what I find still fairly fascinating is Germany understood the utility of hedging throughout the Cold War. And now even this possibility of hedging is decreasing because just the ability of German engineers to enrich uranium for civilian purposes, but just in general, like nuclear technology, is already diminishing. All of these capabilities, all of this knowledge will only be in Germany for a little longer. And from a strategic perspective, this is at least something that we need to be aware of. There are about 10 tactical nuclear weapons in an air base in Germany. And throughout the last 30 years, they have remained there. And the system that was originally set up in 1959 has basically remained in place with, of course, some kind of modernization of the capabilities. But in the big picture, it's still the same. And you had a lot of criticism from parties in the German government and also the population of removing those missiles. But in the end, throughout all these 30 years, ever since the end of the Cold War, They stayed there ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The necessity and utility of these weapons has gained much more importance. And all these questions of extended deterrence, should Europe develop its own nuclear capabilities independent of the United States? What's Germany's role in all of this is very much alive. Nothing formal has been decided, but in the big picture of things, there are three options on the table. So the first option is that a certain change in strategic doctrine in the United States, that there's just a certain question mark behind US engagement and commitment to NATO. Should Europe develop some kind of other mechanism? One mechanism that we could think of is that a similar process would be established with French tactical nuclear weapons, or even in some kind of future scenario with British tactical nuclear weapons that they don't have yet, but they're in the process of building. So one can imagine that instead of a Tornado jet, you would train Germans to fly. They don't fly Rafales. They can be trained, but the nuclear weapons would be provided by the French. And they do have somewhat of an equivalent tactical nuclear weapon to the ones that exist right now. The other option, of course, is there the possibility for these currently non-nuclear European states to develop nuclear weapons? And the truth is, yes, they can. Germany has still a limited amount, but it exists, of highly enriched fissile material. They use it for research purposes, but it is there. And Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, all sorts of other European countries also have the technical capability to enrich uranium. And there are also certain platforms that could be used for such a purpose. So in Germany, for example, it could be the Taurus long-range strike. It's not easy because, of course, there wouldn't be any testing. It all would be computer simulated. It's not an easy endeavor. But if you just want to do it for mainly political deterrence, signaling mechanisms or bargaining mechanisms, I'm not talking about whether this should happen, but the technical feasibility, I think, is there. The third one is that you basically say you don't need nuclear at all, and you would just massively increase your conventional capabilities. And there's all sorts of research that suggests that some long-range capabilities could actually have a strategic function. So, for example, you could use deep strikes of Taurus missiles to target nuclear silos in Russia right now. All of this is also fairly hypothetical, but you could come up with some concept where conventional weapons have a strategic role. And you think through how to deter nuclear weapons with purely conventional capabilities.
For the first time since the Cold War, nuclear weapons questions are back at the top of Berlin security debates.
Obviously and unsurprisingly, there are new and profound questions about the current and also the future US leadership role in the Euro-Atlantic security order. There are also big questions about how Euro-American relations will evolve in the years to come. But the big question about how reliable US nuclear protection commitments are is an old question, and we see repeatedly in history crises of confidence, or at least perceived crises of confidence, even if in practice there is actually no real crisis of confidence. One of the famous examples of when skepticism was raised and indeed increased about this was when German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt gave a speech at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London in October 1977, when Schmidt made the important and very controversial point at the time that the strategic nuclear forces of both the United States and the Soviet Union were, quote, neutralized, unquote. That was an ambiguous term, but the implication was that ultimately the United States would be very unlikely to ever use strategic nuclear weapons in the course of a potential crisis and war in Europe. And so this has been an old and often debated issue, the question even how reliable U.S. nuclear protection commitments are. It is also an analytical methodological issue. how do various observers actually develop their judgments about this? It is not just the question what those judgments are, but also the question, what is the analytical calculus underpinning those judgments? Or are we merely encountering, let's say, opinions and loose comments, etc.? All of this being said, and considering the current situation, it is indeed very important to note that the United States government under the current presidency of Donald Trump has reconfirmed the United States nuclear protection arrangements that existed before. And indeed, contrary to many impressions you might glean from many public debates, that is also a largely unsurprising outcome. Of course, there were debates about potential European nuclear options of various kinds, and these debates nevertheless appeared to have reinforced the fundamental belief that U.S. extended nuclear deterrence cannot be replaced by a nearly equivalent security mechanism in a practically relevant timeframe, if it can be replaced at all. And there are good reasons to come up with the assessment that you can't replace a U.S. extended nuclear deterrence. It is also very important to note here that Germany reconfirmed its participation in NATO nuclear sharing by making the basic decision in 2021 and 2022 to procure F-35A Lightning II Strike fighters. Indeed, from an historically informed perspective, one could say that this decision was the second basic decision in favor of cooperating with the United States and in NATO in terms of nuclear sharing. The second basic decision after 1957. That was when the first basic decision was made. And then there is a strategic perspective that really matters here. So a perspective that focuses on medium and long-term developments. In the early 1960s, there was the profound question whether, and if so, how, U.S. extended nuclear deterrence would work under conditions of two-sided strategic parity in the medium and long run. In simple terms, the Soviet Union and the United States were widely estimated, and indeed correctly, to remain locked in a situation of mutual nuclear vulnerability and later on essential equivalence in strategic nuclear forces. And so a big question was, how would U.S. nuclear protection work under such conditions, if at all? This turned out to be manageable somehow, but nowadays there is a new question about whether, and if so, how U.S. nuclear deterrence will work in the medium and long run under the novel conditions of three-sided parity in strategic forces between the United States, Russia, and China. Of course, if China continues to build up its nuclear forces, as is widely expected at this point in time.
There's very much a realization that Germany needs to rethink nuclear. I don't think that this is something that they would just leave out or leave to the French and the British. I don't think Germany is currently on the path of developing its own nuclear weapon. I don't think that this is in the cards. But I could imagine that there might be some kind of European mechanism. But the European mechanism very much depends on developments in the United States. And if you have a Trump who will publish national security strategy sometime soon, really saying now the enemy is within and NATO is no longer important, if there's just much more of a crystallization that the United States is basically pulling out, although the latest NATO summit sent somewhat of a positive signal, also in response to these pledges of 5%, it seems that Trump is still somewhat on board. But if you just see over the next months and years that the US is really shifting gear, and then depending what happens domestically, if you just see that they get absorbed with their own domestic politics, then I think these European steps towards some alternative nuclear sharing, they could become a reality. But then, of course, you look at France. But he knows what's happening there. And frankly, you also have to look at Great Britain. And I don't think Nigel Farage, as a prime minister, would necessarily be interested in some kind of nuclear sharing mechanism with the Germans. So I think they're on all fronts. There are question marks. But I think what for Germany right now is the most important is to understand and gain knowledge to the best of their abilities of what options they have, how they have thought about these issues in the past, how other countries have been thinking about these issues. And it's interesting. Putin indicated that he wanted to extend the arms control agreement with the United States. And so Germany should be very supportive. And if there could be track 2, 1.5 negotiations of how to extend it, how to make this possible, I think Germany could play a very important role in all of this. When you go back in the history of arms control, it is all about creative thinking. That's the magic of arms control. And Germany could play a role in these processes and fully understanding what might be possible in some way, even by reconfiguring the known into something that is unknown. So the next 15 to 20 years, I think it's about thinking very creatively how to create some kind of stability in this new world.
What can we learn from the West Germany case for nuclear non-proliferation? States can become highly influential on a regional and even a global level in the international system, even if they don't control nuclear weapons. States which are industrially and financially capable of producing nuclear weapons can achieve even most important national objectives without controlling nuclear weapons. In the case of the Federal Republic of Germany, the country's unification in 1990 was such a crucial national objective, which was ultimately achieved even without the control of national nuclear weapons on the part of West Germany. Actually, it could be argued that the entire process of Germany's reunification rested on an expectation that future Germany would remain a non-nuclear weapon state. There is then an open question if the status of a great power is really tied to nuclear weapons. Oftentimes this is just asserted or believed, but the question is really why that should be the case necessarily. Or can we think of a great power status even without the control of nuclear weapons? Another lesson is also here that maintaining the status as a non-nuclear weapon state is also not free from risks, a concern that was voiced particularly in the 1960s. Another important lesson here is that U.S. nuclear protection and the related nuclear security arrangements like nuclear sharing in NATO had and continue to have non-proliferation benefits, even if this was not their primary function, because their primary function is to support collectives' security and deterrence. Some versions of folk and also academic international relations theory are at odds with what historical experience indicates if we consider the case of West Germany during the Cold War. It is often asserted that states maximize power or that states seek security, and this is often also related to indeed strong security-related arguments for why it should be in the interest of certain states to seek nuclear weapons. But the reasons for why states do not pursue nuclear weapons can indeed be complex, as particularly the case of former West Germany shows. In the case of West Germany, we can assess in hindsight that the nuclear policies of governments under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer were shaped by what might be called a strategic logic of nuclear restraint. And this does also not mean that these nuclear security policies were fully consistent or free from ambiguities. But nevertheless, a strong case can be made that there was a guiding strategic logic underpinning the policy of not seeking to become a nuclear-armed state. And of course, there were various other considerations here. And the weight of history and the weight of the historical experiences with Germany, particularly during the era of the two world wars, of course, played a tremendous role here, as well as other value judgments. But nevertheless, we should also think about the non-pursuit of nuclear weapons in a strategic way. And